A Draxian hellhound's razor-sharp claws tore through flesh and bone as it ripped apart a Zorgak slave child before the horrified Galactic Council. The massive six-legged beast, with its spiked tail and fiery eyes, was the apex predator of the Draxian homeworld. Unparalleled in its ferocity, the hellhound had never been tamed in all the eons since the universe formed from cosmic dust. The hellhound's handler struggled to contain its thrashing bulk, straining against the control rods. If the beast broke free in the Grand Hall, hundreds of the most influential beings in the galaxy would die screaming as it shredded them to bloody pulp. Chris Adams, one of the few humans invited to the summit, watched the handler's desperation with morbid fascination. The 32-year-old xenobiologist understood better than most the devastating power of a Draxian hellhound. Countless Draxians had lost their lives trying to control these living weapons, and now with the hellhound only inches away from the council members, Chris knew time was running out. He had to act fast, or the galaxy's leaders would be torn to pieces before the negotiations even began. The fate of trillions hung by a thread. The council chamber erupted in a cacophony of voices as Chris stepped back from the hellhound's enclosure. Stunned faces stared at the human, some in awe, others in disbelief or anger. "This is an outrage," a Zorgak's counselor shouted. "The human's actions could have doomed us all." "But they didn't," a Kree ambassador countered. "In fact, he seemed to calm the beast. We should study this further." Zephyr, caught between his loyalty to Chris and his duties, raised his hands. "Friends, please, let us adjourn and discuss these events in a more orderly fashion." As the council dispersed, Chris lingered by the hellhound's cage. The creature paced, whimpering and pawing at its mouth. Chris leaned closer, noticing the beast's discomfort. There, lodged in its gums, was a jagged tooth, undoubtedly causing immense pain. Chris turned to the Draxian caretaker. "Kozrak, the hellhound needs medical attention. That tooth must be removed." Kozrak scoffed. "Foolish human. Draxians believe in the survival of the fittest. To interfere would be weakness." Appalled, Chris resolved to act. He pulled Zephyr aside as the hall cleared out. "We have to help. Meet me here tonight and bring a med kit." Under the cover of darkness, they crept into the exhibit. Chris approached the hellhound, murmuring softly. Remarkably, the beast remained still, allowing Chris to examine its maw. With careful precision, he extracted the offending tooth. The hellhound let out a sigh, the pain finally gone. As they turned to leave, Kozrak blocked their path, flanked by livid council members. "Explain yourselves," Kozrak demanded. Chris squared his shoulders. "I couldn't stand by and watch a creature suffer, no matter its species or reputation." His words ignited a fierce debate among the councillors about the nature of compassion and the duties of advanced civilizations. The arguments grew heated as the night wore on, with no clear resolution in sight. The council chamber buzzed with heated arguments as the debate over Chris's actions raged on. Voices rose and fell, each species advocating for their own interests and beliefs. Amidst the chaos, a hush suddenly fell over the room as all eyes turned towards the hellhound's enclosure. The massive beast, once a snarling embodiment of primal fury, now romped and played with a large rubber ball, its tail wagging with unbridled joy. It pawed at a puzzle feeder, working to extract the treats hidden within. The hellhound's demeanor had transformed from one of pure aggression to that of a curious, intelligent creature. Chris watched in awe, a grin spreading across his face. He had always suspected that there was more to these beasts than met the eye, and now he had proof. Kozrak, the Draxian caretaker, stood beside him, his arms crossed and his brow furrowed. "I never thought I'd see the day," Kozrak muttered, shaking his head. "A hellhound playing like a common pet. Perhaps there is some merit to your methods, human." The council members murmured amongst themselves, the significance of this development sinking in. The Archon, a wise and ancient being, stepped forward, his voice ringing out across the chamber. "It is clear that we have much to learn about these creatures," the Archon declared. Chris Adams, in light of your unique connection with the Hellhound, we hereby grant you temporary custody of the beast for further study. Your findings may well reshape our understanding of the galaxy's apex predators. Chris could hardly contain his excitement as he thanked the Council for the opportunity. He turned to the Hellhound, which had now settled down and was watching him intently. "Hey there, buddy," Chris said softly, reaching out to pet the beast's massive head. "Looks like it's just you and me now. I think I'll call you Shadow." Over the next few weeks, Chris and Shadow worked together tirelessly, forming an unbreakable bond built on trust and understanding. Shadow proved to be an incredibly quick learner, mastering complex tasks and displaying a level of loyalty that astounded even the most skeptical observers. Chris meticulously documented their progress, sharing his findings with the Council and the wider scientific community. As news of their success spread, other species began to question their own treatment of apex predators, with some even advocating for more compassionate approaches to wildlife management. However, not everyone was thrilled by this development. On the Draxian homeworld, a powerful warlord named Kragnar seethed with rage as he watched the footage of Chris and Shadow working together in harmony. "This is an insult to our way of life," Kragnar roared, slamming his fist on the table. "The humans' actions threaten to undermine centuries of Draxian tradition. We cannot allow this to continue." Kragnar gathered his supporters and marched on the council chamber, demanding that the Hellhound be returned to Draxian custody. He claimed that it was their sovereign right to control the beast, and that any interference by outsiders was a direct affront to their culture. The council, caught off guard by Kragnar's sudden appearance, found themselves at an impasse. Some members advocated for a diplomatic solution, hoping to find a compromise that would satisfy all parties. Others, however, pushed for a show of force, believing that any concession to the Draxians would only embolden their aggression. As tensions mounted, Chris found himself at the center of a political firestorm that threatened to engulf the entire galaxy. He looked to Shadow, who stood by his side, a silent guardian in the face of uncertainty. Chris knew that he had unintentionally sparked a crisis that could have far-reaching consequences, but he also knew that he could not back down from his convictions. With a heavy heart, Chris prepared to face the challenges ahead, knowing that the fate of not just Shadow but the entire galaxy hung in the balance. Chris pored over the footage of Shadow's interactions with the wild Hellhound pack, his eyes glued to the screen. He watched as the beasts communicated with each other through a series of growls, whines, and body language. It was a complex system, one that he had never seen before in any other species. "There's more to these creatures than we ever realized," Chris muttered to himself, his mind racing with possibilities. He spent hours analyzing the footage, taking meticulous notes on the Hellhound's behavior. The more he watched, the more he became convinced that the key to understanding these beasts lay not in their interactions with other species, but in their relationships with each other. Chris burst into the council chamber, his eyes alight with excitement. "I have a proposal," he announced, his voice ringing out across the room. "I believe that the only way to truly understand the Hellhounds is to observe them in their natural habitat, among their own kind." The council members exchanged skeptical glances, but Chris pressed on. "I want to take Shadow to the Draxian homeworld and integrate into a wild Hellhound pack. By living among them, I can learn their language and social structure and gain insights that could help bridge the gap between our species." The room erupted into a cacophony of voices, some in support of Chris's plan, others vehemently opposed. The debate raged on for hours, with each side presenting their arguments with increasing fervor. Finally, the Archon raised his hand, silencing the room. "While we recognize the potential risks involved," he said, his voice grave, "we cannot deny the benefits that could come from such an endeavor. Chris Adams, we will provide you with the necessary resources and protection for your mission, but be warned, the dangers you face will be great." Chris nodded solemnly, his resolve unwavering. "I understand the risks, but I believe this is the only way to truly understand these creatures and build a lasting peace." As Chris and Shadow prepared for their journey, Kragnar seethed with rage. He saw the humans' mission as a direct threat to Draxian supremacy, and he would not allow it to succeed. "So you will ensure that the human fails," Kragnar growled to his warriors. "Use any means necessary. We cannot allow him to undermine our way of life." The warriors bowed their heads, their eyes glinting with malice. They would not fail their master. When Chris and Shadow arrived on the Draxian homeworld, they were met with a mixture of curiosity and hostility. Some Draxians approached them cautiously, intrigued by the sight of a human and a tamed hellhound. Others glared at them with open contempt, seeing Chris as a threat to their traditions. Chris ignored the stares and whispers, focusing instead on his mission. He and Shadow set out into the wilderness, searching for a wild hellhound pack to join. It took days of tracking and careful observation, but finally they found a suitable group. Chris watched from a distance as Shadow approached the pack, his head lowered in a submissive posture. The wild hellhounds were wary at first, sniffing and circling Shadow with suspicion, but gradually they began to accept him, allowing him to join in their hunts and social interactions. Chris followed at a distance, using his xenobiologist skills to observe and document the pack's behavior. He marveled at the complexity of their social structure, the way they communicated with each other through a series of subtle cues and vocalizations. But just as Chris was beginning to make progress, disaster struck. A rival pack led by Kragnar's disguised warriors launched a surprise attack on Chris and Shadow's group. The hellhounds fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. In the chaos of the battle, Chris was separated from Shadow, finding himself surrounded by Kragnar's warriors. He tried to fight back, but it was useless. The warriors closed in, their weapons raised for the kill. Chris closed his eyes, bracing himself for the end. But then a deafening roar split the air. Chris's eyes snapped open to see Shadow charging towards him, the rest of the pack at his heels. The loyal hellhound had rallied his new companions, leading them in a fierce counter-attack against the invaders. The battle was short but brutal. Shadow and his pack tore through the enemy warriors, their fangs and claws rending flesh and bone. Kragnar's forces were soon in full retreat, fleeing back to their master in disgrace. Chris watched in awe as Shadow returned to his side, his muzzle stained with blood. He reached out and stroked the hellhound's fur, marveling at the incredible display of loyalty and intelligence he had just witnessed. Around them, the Draxian observers began to murmur amongst themselves. They had never seen a hellhound act with such purpose and coordination before. Perhaps there was more to these creatures than they had ever realized. As the dust settled, Chris knew that his mission had taken on a new level of importance. He had not only gained valuable insights into hellhound behavior, but he had also witnessed firsthand the potential for these beasts to be allies rather than enemies. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but with Shadow by his side, Chris knew that anything was possible. Together, they would work to build a new future, one in which humans and hellhounds could coexist in peace and understanding. Whispers of Shadow's bravery spread like wildfire across the Draxian homeworld. In the streets and markets, Draxians huddled together, discussing the incredible feat they had witnessed. Many found themselves questioning the very beliefs they had held for generations. If a hellhound, a creature they had always seen as nothing more than a vicious beast, could display such loyalty and selflessness, perhaps there was more to them than they had ever realized. Kragnar, once a figure of unquestioned authority, now faced a growing wave of dissent among his people. His warriors, who had always followed his commands without hesitation, began to express doubts about the wisdom of their aggressive stance towards the hellhounds and the galaxy at large. Chris, sensing the shift in public opinion, knew that the time had come to confront Kragnar directly. He requested an audience with the warlord, determined to make one final attempt at reason. The meeting took place in Kragnar's grand hall, a cavernous space adorned with the trophies of countless hunts. Chris stood before the warlord, his heart pounding in his chest as he faced the imposing figure. "Kragnar," Chris began, his voice steady despite his nerves, "I come before you not as an enemy, but as someone who has seen the true nature of the hellhounds. They are not mere beasts, but intelligent, social creatures with the potential to be valuable allies. Kragnar's eyes narrowed, his face twisting into a sneer. You speak of alliance with animals? You would have us abandon our traditions, our very way of life, for what? To appease the weak and the cowardly? Chris stood his ground, meeting Kragnar's gaze without flinching. It is not weakness to recognize the value in others, to seek understanding instead of conquest. The hellhounds have shown us that they are capable of so much more than we ever believed. Imagine what we could achieve if we worked together instead of against each other. Kragnar slammed his fist on the arm of his throne, his voice booming through the hall. Enough! You speak of cooperation, but all I hear is the mewling of a weakling who would see the Draxian spirit broken. If you truly believe in the strength of your convictions, then prove it. I challenge you to a traditional Draxian duel. If you win, I will consider your words, but if you lose, the hellhounds will be ours to do with as we please. Chris felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that he stood no chance against Kragnar in physical combat. The warlord was a seasoned warrior, his body honed by years of battles. But Chris also knew that he could not back down, not when the fate of the hellhounds and the future of Draxian society hung in the balance. I accept your challenge, Chris said, his voice ringing out clear and strong. The duel was set to take place in the grand arena, before the eyes of the entire Draxian populace. Chris stood at one end of the arena, his heart racing as he watched Kragnar emerge from the opposite side. The warlord was a fearsome sight, his body clad in traditional Draxian battle armor, his eyes glinting with a fierce determination. The battle began, and it quickly became clear that Chris was outmatched. Kragnar's strength and speed were unparalleled, and Chris found himself struggling to even defend himself against the warlord's relentless attacks. As Kragnar bore down on him, his blade poised for the final strike, Chris closed his eyes, bracing himself for the end. But the blow never came. Instead, he heard a deafening roar, and opened his eyes to see shadow leaping into the fray, placing itself between Chris and Kragnar. The hellhound stood firm, its body shielding Chris from harm. Even as Kragnar's blade cut deep into its flesh, the crowd fell silent, stunned by the display of selfless bravery. Kragnar himself seemed taken aback, his blade hovering in mid-air as he stared at the wounded hellhound. In that moment, Chris seized his chance. "Do you see now, Kragnar?" he cried out, his voice raw with emotion. "This is the true strength of the hellhounds, not physical prowess, but loyalty, courage, and the willingness to protect others. These are the qualities we should all aspire to, not just in our treatment of the hellhounds, but in our relationships with each other." Kragnar looked from shadow to Chris, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he lowered his blade. "The duel is over," he declared, his voice ringing out across the arena. "The human has proven his point. We will reconsider our stance on the hellhounds and our role in the galaxy." As the crowd erupted into cheers, Chris rushed to Shadow's side, cradling the wounded hellhound in his arms. He worked frantically to stem the flow of blood, but even as he did so, he could feel Shadow's life force ebbing away. In the end, despite Chris's best efforts, Shadow succumbed to its injuries. The hellhound died as it had lived, with courage and loyalty, and in the service of a greater cause. The Draxians, moved by Shadow's sacrifice, held a grand funeral for the fallen hellhound. They laid Shadow to rest with all the honors of a true hero, acknowledging the profound impact it had on their society. As Chris stood before the funeral pyre, he felt a mixture of grief and determination. Shadow's death would not be in vain. He would carry on the hellhound's legacy, working tirelessly to promote understanding and cooperation between species. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.